We talk about the trenches, the battles, the sheer human cost of World War I, but behind every charge, every shell, every desperate struggle, there was another war being fought, a hidden financial war, waged in the counting houses of London, Berlin, and New York. This wasn't just a conflict of armies. It was a battle of balance sheets, a desperate scramble for money that broke empires, reshaped global finance, and set the stage for the economic catastrophes of the 20th century. The Great War wasn't just won by courage on the battlefield. It was won by those who could bleed their treasuries dry last. And the true long-term bill for that victory would be paid for generations. To truly grasp the financial nightmare of World War I, you first have to comprehend its unprecedented industrial scale. This was not like previous limited wars. Industrialization meant that weapons were deadlier, armies were larger, and the sheer volume of material needed, from millions of bullets to colossal battleships, from endless miles of barbed wire to mountains of rations, was astronomical. Governments, many already heavily indebted from prior conflicts and lavish imperial spending, stared down an abyss of expenditure. They knew, almost immediately, that they couldn't possibly pay for a conflict of this magnitude through traditional taxes alone. Their populations simply didn't possess enough wealth. So, with little other choice, they turned to a range of desperate and ultimately destructive financial strategies, fundamentally changing the relationship between the state, its citizens, and global capital. Let's start with the most immediate and seemingly straightforward response: borrowing. Both the Allied and Central Powers immediately began issuing massive amounts of war bonds, essentially IOUs to their citizens and, wherever possible, to other nations. Propaganda posters, some of the most iconic imagery of the era, plastered cities and towns, urging citizens with fervent nationalism to buy war bonds or save for victory. The message was clear and emotionally potent. Buying a bond wasn't just a safe investment. It was an undeniable act of patriotism, a direct, tangible contribution to securing victory and protecting their homeland. But this widespread public participation, while crucial for national morale and providing some capital, was only a fraction of the story. The truly staggering sums came from an entirely different source. Governments also took out enormous loans from their own central banks, effectively leveraging their national financial institutions, and most crucially, from foreign powers and international financiers. Great Britain, the undisputed financial superpower of the early 20th century, began the war as a global creditor, extending vital loans to its beleaguered allies like France and Russia. But as the conflict escalated and stretched far beyond initial expectations, even Britain, with its vast empire, began to exhaust its financial reserves and was forced to turn to the rapidly emerging financial giant across the Atlantic, the United States. While the European powers were locked in a brutal, mutually destructive struggle, bleeding each other dry on the battlefields of the Western Front and beyond, the United States initially maintained a stance of neutrality. However, American banks and industries quickly became the indispensable financial engine of the Allied war effort. Long before U.S. troops set foot on European soil, American financial institutions, particularly the powerful investment bank J.P. Morgan & Co., facilitated massive credit lines and loans to Britain and France. These financial lifelines allowed the Allied powers to purchase immense quantities of vital supplies, state-of-the-art weapons, and desperately needed food from American factories and farms. It's crucial to understand these weren't acts of charity. They were high-interest loans that would profoundly shift the global financial center of gravity from the old world of London to the burgeoning financial capital of New York. By 1917, when the U.S. finally abandoned its neutrality and entered the war, it had undergone a stunning transformation. From being a debtor nation, dependent on European capital, it had become the world's largest creditor, holding the financial leash on much of war-torn Europe. This massive and rapid financial reordering of the world during the war set the stage for future global power dynamics, international debt crises, and fundamentally altered the trajectory of the 20th century. But even borrowing, on an unprecedented scale, proved insufficient to cover the insatiable, bottomless appetite of the industrial war machine. Governments were forced to resort to an even more dangerous and ultimately ruinous strategy: printing money. This was especially prevalent among the Central Powers, particularly in countries like Germany and Austria-Hungary, who found their access to international credit markets increasingly restricted by the Allied blockade. Unable to collect enough taxes or secure sufficient external loans to fund their monumental expenditures, their central bank simply created new currency out of thin air, often unbacked by gold reserves. This massive injection of unbacked money into the economy had an inevitable and destructive consequence: inflation. Prices for goods and services began to rise, slowly at first, but with an ever-increasing velocity as the war progressed. While not yet the hyperinflation that would plague Germany in the 1920s, this wartime inflation silently and steadily eroded the purchasing power of their citizens, effectively acting as a hidden, insidious tax to pay for the conflict, disproportionately impacting the poor and middle class. The immense financial strain also forced governments to impose increasingly draconian controls on their economies, transforming them into centralized war economies. In Germany, this led to a system of total economic mobilization, characterized by strict rationing of food and fuel, rigid price controls on essential goods, and direct government control and allocation of industrial resources. Britain, though operating within a more democratic framework, implemented similar, though perhaps less severe, measures, including widespread rationing, extensive control over shipping, and direction of labor. Both sides engaged intensely in economic warfare tactics, attempting to starve the other's economy. The British naval blockade, a powerful but controversial weapon, crippled Germany's access to vital raw materials and food, gradually strangling its economy. Conversely, German U-boat campaigns aimed to cut off Britain's crucial supply lines, threatening its very survival. These tactics weren't just about direct military advantage. They were about achieving financial attrition, hoping to break the enemy's will and, more importantly, its capacity to sustain the incredibly costly war effort. The true financial disaster, however, was not immediately apparent. It was largely postponed, silently building beneath the surface until after the fighting finally stopped. When the armistice was signed in November 1918, the victorious Allied nations, particularly France and Great Britain, found themselves saddled with staggering, unprecedented debts to the United States. They had won the war, but they were financially exhausted. Simultaneously, the defeated Central Powers, especially Germany, were forced to accept the crushing burden of massive war reparations under the punitive terms of the Treaty of Versailles. The Allies, in their short-sightedness, harbored a naive belief that these reparations from Germany would cover their own immense war costs and allow them to repay their significant American loans. But this was a financial fantasy, a house of cards built on unrealistic expectations. Germany's economy was in ruins, its industrial heartland occupied, and the sums demanded were utterly impossible to pay without fundamentally destroying its economic future. This impossible situation created a vicious, self-perpetuating cycle that crippled the entire global economy for over a decade. Germany, facing an insurmountable reparations bill and unable to secure new loans, began to print money at an astronomical rate, leading directly to the infamous hyperinflation of the early 1920s. The German mark became literally worthless, destroying the savings of an entire generation and destabilizing the young republic. This meant that France and Britain couldn't collect the reparations they desperately needed from Germany, which in turn made it incredibly difficult, if not impossible, for them to repay their massive war debts to the US. The United States, having transitioned to the world's leading creditor, stubbornly insisted on full repayment, often refusing to acknowledge the intricate, interconnected web of debts and reparations. This unyielding stance effectively positioned America as the world's reluctant and often unsympathetic banker, a complex and challenging role it struggled to manage, contributing to a sense of resentment and economic instability across the globe. The unresolved financial legacy of World War I directly and tragically set the stage for an even greater global catastrophe: World War II. The punitive reparations and the resulting hyperinflation in Germany created immense economic despair, widespread social unrest, and a deep-seated national humiliation, all of which provided fertile ground for the rise of political extremism and ultimately facilitated Hitler's ascent to power. Simultaneously, the burden of unresolved intra-Allied debts, coupled with the collapse of international trade as nations resorted to protectionist policies, contributed significantly to the fragile global economy that ultimately plunged into the Great Depression. The illusion of a quick financial recovery after the Great War, fueled by a desire to forget the horrors, was just that, a dangerous illusion. The true financial reckoning was simply delayed, festering beneath the surface. So, what profound lessons can this century-old financial nightmare teach us today? It serves as a stark, undeniable reminder that wars are not merely fought on battlefields with soldiers and weapons, but equally in central banks, in treasury departments, and across the intricate web of global financial markets. The financial choices, often made in desperation and under immense pressure during a time of existential crisis, have consequences that ripple and echo for decades, if not centuries, fundamentally altering geopolitical landscapes and economic structures. It reveals the destructive, long-term power of unchecked government debt and highlights the dangerous, seductive temptation to simply print money to cover colossal expenses, a strategy that, history consistently demonstrates, inevitably leads to crippling inflation and systemic economic instability, disproportionately harming ordinary citizens. Moreover, it eloquently illustrates how quickly and dramatically global power shifts when financial dominance changes hands, transforming the international order and establishing new hegemonies in ways that even decisive military victories alone cannot achieve. The hidden financial struggle behind World War I was far more than just accounting. It was a desperate, high-stakes game of chicken with national treasuries. A game that ultimately led to a profound global economic breakdown. It taught the world, through immense suffering, that the true, full cost of war is rarely paid in its entirety when the guns finally fall silent. If you learned something, hit subscribe. Have a prosperous day.